Yes, so as Daijusi said, I've been an activist for most of my life, and I've been involved with some incredibly effective actions. I was involved with Green and Common, which got rid of first strike cruise missiles. I was involved with an action breaking into Buckingham Palace, which stopped nuclear testing in the Arizona desert. And I was involved, as Daijoti said, with the group that disarmed a Hawk warplane. And also I was involved with pulling up GM crops. And we managed to kick GM pretty much out of Britain after that. So incredibly successful. And this is a tribute to the method. Non-violent civil disobedience, incredibly effective in my sort of lifelong experience of doing these actions. They work. And also most of these actions that I've been, in fact, almost all of those actions that I've been involved with have been very small groups of people, like 10 or 15 people. So with a small number of people, you can really pack a non-violent punch, as it were. Eventually, the bad news is that eventually I did burn out from that. And that was because I realised as I burnt out, I realised that I'd been trying to follow a spiritual practice as part of the non-violent civil disobedience, but I didn't have a spiritual home, and I realised that that's what I needed. I was missing an anchor, a spiritual anchor in my life, and so then I went about to sort that out and took up the Buddhist path, which I continue to be on. So I've been doing that for about 15 years or 16 years, something like that. And it did restore, over the years, it did restore me from my burnout. But I always felt like there was something missing. And that was something missing in me because I wasn't back in the fray and being active. I was just, sitting on the cushion mostly, not doing very much activism. But also something missing in Buddhism itself. And that's what this talk is about. It's about me trying to find out what was missing. And that eventually emerged as this mythic calling to non-violent civil disobedience. Again, but doing it differently with this anchor. And so then I could be part of the Extinction Rebellion, which, if you haven't heard of yet, I'm sure you'll be hearing about it over the time of the festival. So that was a rebellion that was incredibly successful in April in London. We shut down the centre of London, if you don't know about that, so I was involved with that, so I'll be talking about that later as well. So, but before I get into this, I'd just like to explain something that I find has been a really useful concept that I learnt from Buddhism about near enemies and far enemies. So if you take something like love, the far enemy of love would be hatred, so it's quite easy to spot. But the near enemy, or lots of near enemies, are much harder to spot. So things like sentimentalism, romanticism, the kind of joy that is slightly tinged with envy, if you know that experience, and all of these kinds of things that are a bit like love, but not quite it. I'm calling near enemies, and they're kind of masquerading as the real thing. So one example that's quite useful, if you've ever been on a silent retreat, you'll know that being on a silent retreat is very different from just not talking. Okay, so you stand at a bus stop and you're not talking, but there's not very much else happening, is there? There's no sort of big thing happening. You're just standing, not talking. Whereas when you're on retreat, there's a palpable different atmosphere that could be seen from outside it as well. People would know that something different was happening. So in protest actions, you often see non-violence being used as a tactic, which is quite a valid way to use it as part of a kind of political battle. But principled, what I'm going to call principled non-violence, or you could call it spiritual non-violence, is quite a different thing. And it's about placing truth and personal life, your personal life, our personal lives, in front of injustice and lies. And the kind of truth, not an absolute truth, but a truth that we're all looking for together. If that spirit is there, if that spirit isn't there, I would call that not being violent, as opposed to non-violence. So I'll say a bit more about this. It's almost the same as non-violence, but it's not quite the same. It's a near enemy. So a good example of this is the Buddha used the example of a stringed instrument to describe the right kind of attention that you need to meditate. So you want the strings to be just the right tension. If they're too tight, it makes a horrible pingy sound, sounds harsh. And if it's too slack, you're not going to get a sound out of it at all. So you want the strings to be just the right tension to make the music. And it's exactly the same, actually, with non-violent civil disobedience. You need to get the right tension. So a lot of people think that non-violence is just not being violent, right? But it's different. It needs a confrontation. It needs some grit. Otherwise, nothing's going to change. But if it's too tight, it's going to lean into aggression. So it's very difficult to find that, if you meditate, you'll know how difficult it is to find that right balance between relaxation and alertness. And it's the same with non-violent disobedience. So if it's too slack, it's kind of passive and flaccid, and not very much will change. And that's what I call not being violent. So when the tension is right with non-violent action, it kind of accrues attention almost without you having to do anything. It attracts respect and awe, and people can sort of pick up that there's a different thing happening. I'll say more about this later. So it's going beyond non-violence as a tactic. It's ordinary human vulnerability and honesty, confronting greed, violence and hatred and delusion, those, the old chestnuts that we know about. And this is what's going to expose the injustice. So in Buddhism, we have the ethical practice of not harming. And, well, you could say that this is also a bit like the near enemy of not being violent. But it's hard enough to achieve, isn't it? If you've tried to practice non-harming, it's not easy. In fact, you're unlikely to accomplish it in a lifetime. If you then add to that stillness, simplicity and contentment, you can very easily end up with this near enemy of being passive. And this is why I think that, unfortunately, Buddhism kind of leans towards a kind of a small c conservatism or quietism. And this is a near enemy that we need to guard against, because I don't believe that that's what the Buddha taught. Sangrakshita also came with the positive precepts, and I think this takes us a stage further than that. But for me, it still didn't go quite far enough. We've also got metta meditation meditation on loving kindness. But sitting in meditation, just thinking loving thoughts, can also be a bit of a near enemy if it doesn't actually end in action or something different happening. So I'm sort of questioning, is that really complete if it doesn't do that? And so all of these near enemies can easily support the view that we have to sort ourselves out, sort our own ethical practice out before we move out into the world. So this is where, for me, the Bodhisattva path comes in, and this is the mythic calling that I'm alluding to, and it offers a reversal of this approach. It's actually the Bodhisattva, the mythic Bodhisattva, delays their own awakening until they've supported everybody else to become awakened themselves. And this is a path that also offers the practice of using the imaginal faculty. And it's something that I started to practice with a couple of years ago. And it has the potential to go much deeper than a metta practice, and create a very deep transformational change, which is what I was looking for. So you might have heard of green Tara. There's lots of images of green Tara around here. Avalokiteshvara is also quite a well-known bodhisattva. And they both have one leg sitting in meditation and one leg stepping into the world. So for me, that's the model of the bodhisattva path. So during a retreat last year, I went on a retreat that was actually called the Bodhisattva Path. And I decided to start inquiring into what had happened to the energy that I used to have for activism, because up to that point, not so much had been happening. And I also put a call out to an imaginal mythic image that I'd been working with for about a year, sort of focusing on in my meditation. And I just want to add to this that working with the imaginal is not the same as reifying or making things literal. So we're talking about an image that's empty of inherent existence. And through being empty, there is the possibility for it to become illumined and to become transformational. And, you know, that transformation comes from the fact that it's empty. And you know, there's a danger because we live in this sort of what I would call a sort of fundamentalist scientism in our society. There's a danger of bringing that literalism into practice. So that's not what I'm talking about. But in calling for this bodhisattva image to support me, it was almost as though he was actually calling for me first. And sort of giving me my marching orders, along with the heart inspiration to resource me for what I wanted to do. There's a certain kind of faith which is called longing, or longing faith. It's in Sanskrit, it's Abhilasha Shraddha. And it begins with a movement of the heart towards our aspirations, and then wills that aspiration into emerging. A kind of sensing into how something is trying to happen. And in doing that, we're called to be in service to that energy that's trying to happen and to try and make it so. A call to enact the myth of the bodhisattva in the world. So this is what I was practicing with on the retreat. And then about 6 weeks after the retreat, I started to feel the first stirrings of this energy that I was tapping into during the retreat, just sort of starting to emerge in my being. And around about the same time that this happened, the latest governmental international climate change report came out around about October. And it hit me like a tsunami, even though I'd been aware of climate change since the early 80s. There was something about the level of emergency that we'd reached that really hit me hard. And I just started experiencing a really deep grief. And it felt like I could no longer connect with nature without also feeling already the loss of the species, you know, noticing that there wasn't as much bird song, not as many insects in my garden. I don't know if you have experienced that. I'm seeing a few nods. And missing species that once were really common. And you know, my heart was really sort of opening to that beauty, but at the same time I could feel this welling up of a really profound sadness, like it was more than my own heart that was breaking. And, you know, Shantideva talks about letting all sorrows ripen in us. But I was finding it hard to open to the magnitude of that sorrow. And it felt like it was a magnitude that was greater than my own death. So this is what brings me to extinction and reflections on what extinction actually means. And it occurred to me that animals that die of extinction probably don't realise that they're the last one. So if you think of something like the last wolf that died in Scotland 200 years ago, it will have been aware that there wasn't a pack around it, but it wouldn't necessarily have known that it was the last wolf. So this is something that we carry, actually. It's not the animals that carry. We carry the extinction. It's a bit like a curse on humans because we have the understanding and the ability to conceive of it. So this is something that goes beyond death, actually, because life belongs to death. So if life goes, then it's the death of death as well. This is extraordinary. I mean, there's never been such a time as the time that we're facing right now. And as far as we know, as far as we can tell, we're the first people that have had to face something like this. If you take, often talk about impermanence as a source of suffering, but impermanence also means the briefness of beauty. I mean, often things that are beautiful are very brief, and in a way that's their beauty. If you think of something like, newly fallen snow, the beauty of that. So it's even the death of impermanence, which again, it's beyond imagining, really. And the impact of this, I was reflecting on, people often talk about the next generation. Of course I feel that. Although I don't have my own children, I feel the enormity of losing the children that we do have, losing their lives. But also our ancestors and our lineage, it's the death of all that has been brought into being, all the creativity, all the courage, all of their wonder at the mystery of life will go with extinction. So can you imagine dying in the knowledge that humans will probably not survive as a species? So this is what I've been reflecting on. All the best of what it is to be human just completely wiped out. And this is a real possibility that we're facing right now. And I just don't know how to die such a death as that. I can conceive of dying my own death, but to die knowing that I might be one of the last humans, I don't know how to do it. So this is what I was hit with at the same time as feeling the rising of this bodhisattva energy coming into me. So it was like an energy that was fed by deep sadness, that was almost like a sort of primal urge of the earth trying to act through me, feeling that energy acting through me. And it was an incredibly strong surge of energy because it was the mixture of this profound sadness and yet the compassion, the desire to try and do something about it. And so it was the strength of that energy that I launched myself into the Extinction Rebellion actions in April that closed down central London. So I spent quite a bit of time on Waterloo Bridge along with many other Buddhists. I think about a third of the bridge was made up of Buddhists. And we blocked the traffic day after day, and we made this beautiful camp that was full of works of art and music and poetry, and it was just really beautiful. And we created a container in which non-violence could flourish, with beauty and solemnity and inspiration and dignity. That's the kind of container that you need for non-violence to really work. It's different to just not being violent. And it was really palpable on the bridge. Anyone who walked past, you could see that they could see this was a different thing. It wasn't just a protest, it was a different thing happening. And after 10 days of blocking the bridge, the police started to move us, and we just decided to allow the police to just move the camp without any struggle. So we didn't struggle for the things that had kept us there, but we sat down ourselves as an act of sacrificial solidarity with life on earth. And we kind of became the bridge of transformation in doing that. We were on a bridge and we became a bridge of transformation. And it was extraordinarily moving and impossible, like I say, impossible not to be affected by the atmosphere. we were like a Vajra lightning bolt. I don't know if you know what a Vajra is, but it's an immovable object met by an unstoppable force. So we were this immovable object sitting on the beach, being met by the unstoppable force of the police arresting us. And they did that in a very respectful and very, very careful in the way that they did that. And you could feel that they also were affected by the atmosphere of the action that we were taking. And so in a way they were actually arrested by us, so that was remarkable. So this is something that is almost like more like a ritual than a protest. It's like sacred theatre. It's like enacting a poetry or a prayer. And it's something that goes deeply into people's hearts and moves them, and I believe starts a transformation process. This kind of action is sorry. Yeah, it's the stuff of our aspirations, and I believe it's totally in alignment with Buddhist practice. It goes into our own hearts so that we ourselves are moved, and I believe it can also sort of create this turning around in the deepest seat of consciousness that Bhante Sangharakshita talks about. That's what it felt like that was happening on the bridge, the rising of the bodhicitta. And this for me is an action as part of the bodhisattva path, that we change ourselves with one leg in meditation at the same time as we change the world by stepping out into the world. So there's nothing more beautiful or inspiring than seeing people standing up in this way and just doing what's right, in the knowledge that we don't know whether we will make the necessary changes that will stop climate change and extinction, but just doing it anyway because it's the right thing to do. And even if we don't make it through climate change and species extinction, it's surely worth giving it a try to do what's right anyway, and to be in service to this energy of what's trying to happen, this feeling of the bodhisattva energy trying to make the change, and us being in service to that. So I'll just say something as well about how another distinction between non-violence as just not being violent and being this sort of powerful non-violent, sort of almost a spiritual force, is that people willingly make themselves vulnerable and are willing to be accountable for what they do. And this is something that if you just see it described, it can appear to be quite a weak position, to stay there and be willing to account for yourself. But actually, because you're drawing from the rightness of your action, you're almost drawing from your own inspiration, as well as the inspiration of all the people that have gone before us, people like Gandhi and Dr. Ambedkar, and many people who've done this before us. So we can draw from their strength as well. And people see that we're drawing strength from the rightness of our action and from our conviction. So from an opponent's point of view, this kind of strength in the face of adversity is really something quite challenging, and it can lead them to respect activists and to start to question their own beliefs, which is what we need to happen if we're going to get real deep change. So actually vulnerability becomes the source of power in this situation. We definitely risk being clobbered, we risk arrest, but the power actually lies in the risk. And this is something that you can't kind of maneuver with as a tactic. You have to be really willing to go there. It's like a leap of faith. You have to be really willing to take that risk and be vulnerable And by showing that, you know, without that risk, we can't lose anything, and therefore we can prove nothing, because we can't effectively demonstrate the strength of our feeling. So vulnerability isn't the aim, but it's the effect of what we're doing. I should also say that when we're doing this, we're actually in a position of privilege. Many of us are middle class, and we're white. And, you know, many of us who do these kinds of actions are privileged. But by doing actions like this, I believe we can be in solidarity with those that don't have the privilege. So we're actually using our privilege to be in solidarity with people who maybe are more at risk than we are to take action like that. So on the last retreat that I was on, I was again reflecting on my feelings of loss, because I still have this feeling when I see nature that I feel the sadness of this loss. And I suspect that deep sadness will probably always be with me. And I was also reflecting on the tragedy of what it is to be human and being at the mercy of our human failings, you know, our personal nonsense of greed, hatred and delusion. And if you've been on retreat, you'll know that, you know, this kind of stuff often comes up, you know, quite darkly and quite starkly when we're on retreat. So I was reflecting on that. And every evening I would hear this nightingale singing, a very, very rare bird. I don't know if you've ever heard a nightingale. But everything else was silent. All the other birds were quiet. And just this beautiful song coming out. And it was as though she was calling to me. And what she said was, she said, "Your grief is beautiful. It's a measure of your love for nature. Let shine your light. There's no possibility, actually, to withhold it. In the face of a darkness so dark that no human ever before has faced, you'll need to be as bold as you possibly can be. Take courage, dear heart. Let all your nonsense be transformed through the crucible of my heart, just like it was on Waterloo Bridge on the last evening. Feel into the beauty of your sadness. Be the best that you can be anyway, because we're out of time and every person's effort is needed. Be the best that you can be." And then she offered me a story that I'll share with you. Once upon a timeless time, perhaps aeons into the future, there will be a child talking to an adult, in wonder about the patterns that are woven by the stars in the night sky. And the parent will reply, "Can you see how the stars from that bird with the wings are spread, and that great star so radiant at her heart? She's the last nightingale. Many aeons ago, the humans who caused the last fire, the great fire on Earth, finally woke up when they heard the last nightingale singing. Their hearts were filled with a longing to be the best that they could be, even as it seemed to be too late. And because they all became the best that they could be, the nightingale was able to take flight with all their courage and wisdom and kindness. She could fly out beyond the boundaries of the earth and into the firmament. And as she flew, she sang the last song of courage, wisdom and kindness. And if you become still and silent and listen attentively, you'll hear that she's still singing her starlight song. And this is how she sings us into being. So I'd like to leave you with a couple of questions before we start an opportunity for you to ask me questions. As you sit in meditation, which song will you hear? And as you step forth into the world, which song will you sing in response?